along with. Whoops, I just want to make sure my PowerPoint is there. See if I can bring that up for you all. All right, there we go. So this is the book that Laura held up that I just published, From Inclusion to Justice. I'm going to read a little bit from this today and talk a lot about the work that went into it. The research that we did, and I did this with a bunch of wonderful student research assistants at Princeton Seminary and Princeton University. We studied 11 different Christian congregations in New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. And these were congregations that were in ministry with disabled people. And in order to participate in the study, both the disabled person who was part of the congregation, sometimes in leadership, sometimes a congregant, they had to be willing to participate, and the congregation did as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found across the board with respect to these congregations. But first, I just want to name also my subject position. So Laura mentioned I am the parent of an 8-year-old who has a progressive genetic disease of the brain and identifies as disabled. Her name is Lucia. And so I wrote this book as an able-bodied parent to an able-bodied church. And I think it's fair to say empirically, and if you look back at the research that Laura and Alan were presenting on, that our churches are primarily able-bodied, especially in terms of their leadership today. So I wrote this as kind of a call in to accountability for us to repent of the sins of ableism and to move from, as I say in the title, from inclusion to justice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. The book also shares a little bit about my personal journey with disability as well. And then the book is primarily centering the voices and experiences of disabled people. However, in this presentation, I lean a little bit more into some of the caregiver stories and parent stories to be in dialogue with the excellent research that Laura and Alan are doing. But I would encourage you to check out the whole book, because I don't want to give the false impression that the book centers able-bodied experiences. It actually tries to decenter them. But this is complicated, right? There's a lot of people in the mix. So that's just something I thought was maybe helpful to say off the top. But generally, if you don't read the book, there are 3 things I would like you to know. One is that we learned from our research that disabled people want a seat at the table when it comes to ministry in the church, which is awesome. We also learned that churches really want to help them with that, which is also awesome. And then not so awesome, we learned that churches are steeped in ableist biases and a paradigm of inclusion that undermines the ministry and leadership of disabled people. So that's why I talk in the book about moving from a paradigm of inclusion towards justice. And in this presentation today, I'm going to talk about ableism. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I'm going to talk about inclusion, explain what I mean by that, and talk a little bit about why I see these as obstacles in following Jesus toward justice. I'm going to share a little bit of my personal story, and then I will talk a lot about 3 people in the book who I learned a lot from. Their names are, and these are their pseudonyms because I'm protecting their confidentiality. Their pseudonyms are Michelle. She's a parent of Jonah, who is an autistic young person, and then Pastor Brad is the pastor who's in relationship with them. So you'll hear a lot about them today. A couple pieces of scripture. There's a lot of scripture in my book, and hopefully there'll be some practical insights as well. So to get started, ableism, I think, is an obstacle to human flourishing, not just for disabled people, but for all of us. I think it's a threat to our common humanity, a threat to our notions of who God is. And if I put this a little bit differently, I think disabled people can teach us about new expansive modes of human flourishing, about critical problems in our culture and theology, and invite us to fuller, broader visions of God and humanity. And I really think this is what Jesus, in his life, his scars, his crucifixion and resurrection, does. As I write in my book, in a church that fetishizes crucifixion, we have surprisingly little tolerance for the injustice, the suffering, and the humanity that come with it. So I'm just actually gonna stop sharing and turn off the slides and talk to you a little bit about what ableism has looked like in my experience with my daughter. So as I mentioned, Lucia is 8 years old, and just to tell you a little bit about how she presents, she doesn't use words to communicate. She doesn't walk. She is in a wheelchair. And she has trouble purposefully moving her body. So a lot of times the perception of Lucia is that she isn't really engaging with the world around her. And there are a lot of assumptions that people bring to interactions with her. And so in my book, I talk about how I learned about my own ableism by way of Lucia, by watching people interact with Lucia, and then also myself when I was interacting with Lucia by watching myself and having my ableism kind of held up as a mirror to me. So I'll end the presentation with that, but I'll tell you 2 stories to talk about what ableism has looked like in my experience. So one story is about how when I was pastoring a church a couple years ago, Lucia was very sick and she had gone into the hospital. She has a lot of medical complexities, and she was at the hospital a very long time, and she finally came home, and we were so glad that she was home. We were rejoicing that she was home. I came to church that Sunday. I couldn't wait to tell people, she's home, and she wasn't doing 100% better, but she was doing better. She was smiling, she was comfortable, right? Such a win. And I was chatting with a woman from church after the service, and she was asking how Lucia was doing. And this joy-filled story, right? She's home, she's doing so much better. I'm so grateful. And Lucia was quite little at this point, maybe 3 years old. And she said, "Oh, how wonderful that she's doing well. Maybe she will even walk and talk someday. Maybe someday she will be normal." And my heart just kind of dropped. And I felt all of this connection that I was experiencing in this conversation where I was bringing this joy. I felt it met with misunderstanding, with criticism around what health and human flourishing looks like for my child. I felt that she was placing an expectation of normalcy on Lucia that she will likely never meet. And so therefore, maybe she will never be healthy, she will never be whole. So that was one experience that I use a lot to talk about ableism and how, well-meaning, right, comments, right, can really be painful. And I think Laura and Alan's presentation attest to some of these. I might call them kind of like ableist microaggressions that folks experience at church. The second story is a story of being in the hospital. I have a lot of those with Lucia. And so this is a secular story to show you that, it's not just the church, right? Out in our educational systems, in most of our institutions, in medicine, it's a lot of folks with disabilities and families experience ableism. And so I was at the hospital, and Lucia was about to go under anesthesia. And the anesthesiologist came in the room, and she was telling me all about the different risks of anesthesia and the procedure. And then she said something like, "Can she understand me? Can Lucia understand me?" And I said, "Oh, yes, she can understand what you're saying. She can nod her head yes, she can shake her head no. She definitely knows what you're saying." And she said, "Really? She can understand everything that I'm saying?" And it wasn't so much the surprise in her voice. That's one thing, right? She's an 8-year-old child. Like, yes, she can understand. But it was the fact that I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you're an anesthesiologist at a children's hospital, and your pervasive assumption seems to be that children like Lucia can't understand you. And I hear this saying in the physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy world all the time: assume communication. And here was this person assuming, I don't know, not communication, like assuming subterfuge, I don't know. And it just really struck me that, again, the common kind of markers of humanity that are afforded to most of us are often taken away from my daughter before she can even try to interact or communicate. And I noticed there was a comment somewhere, and I can't see the comments while I'm talking, but it's not just the perception of difference, but it's the specter of normalcy that looms, I think, over these interactions, obviously one in the church, one in the medical sphere. And I don't mean to pick on folks because, like I said, I've had these own experiences of my own ableism myself. But I think you can see even in, and I want you guys to talk about this at some point, Alan and Laura, the title of your presentation today, Beyond Saints and Superheroes. I mean, to me, the ableism just resounds because, you know, if you're a saint or a superhero, you're not human, right? And so what we're saying is caregivers don't get the opportunity to be human beings. And you'll see that a little bit in the stories I'm going to share today. It sounds good, right? It sounds amazing. It's flattering, but it's really ableism, right? When you think about it. And ableism is kind of extended by proxy to parents of disabled kids, right? Disabled folks really can tell us they've written the book on ableism, but I think that you all point to some ways that this is extended to parents of disabled kids. And I don't want to give anything away about what's coming out in your book, but we've talked a little bit about your research and some of the metaphors that folks use to refer to the church, some of the ways that parents talked about the church. So I wanted to throw a quote in that really resonates with me as a parent of a disabled child, and trying to, and you know, I'm a pastor, right? So like, I think I have access to the church, but this is the way I often feel. And so I'm going to share my screen again, so you can read along with me. So this was the point that I was making about ableism and inclusion as obstacles to human flourishing. So here's the quotation that I want to share, and it's from KJ Ramsey. She is the author of This Too Shall Last. What a compelling title. And she writes about her experience with chronic illness. And she writes suffering, but I think here I'm going to plug in being a parent of a disabled child feels like getting lost in the forest while the rest of the church hikes ahead. And that just resonated with me so much, especially being the parent of an immunocompromised child in the midst of this pandemic. But what I want to say, and what I say in my book, is that it's important to point out that like these aren't just interpersonal problems when it comes to ableism. This is a structural problem. And that's what my research showed, that the predominant paradigm for ministry with disabled people in churches falls under the banner of something like inclusion. And so I have a legal definition of inclusion in my book. Inclusion emphasizes disabled people's rights to full participation in all aspects of society, as well as the provision of appropriate supports so that people with disabilities can be fully integrated into existing environments. But you might, I hope you're already starting to like dissect this quote for yourself. I'm teaching freshman writing right now, and I teach them to read with the grain and against the grain. So you start reading against the grain and you're like, if the focus is to integrate people into existing environments, but those existing environments are the problem, is inclusion going to bring change? And I argue, unfortunately, I don't think it usually does. I think it ends up preserving institutional power, which is decidedly able-bodied. So in the book, I talk about two dominant cultural scripts we often hear among churches. I wonder if you've heard these yourself. So a lot of churches will say, oh, well, like we don't have any disabled people in our congregation, so that's why we're not doing disability ministry. So that's one thing we hear a lot, one kind of pole, like one extreme. And then on the other extreme, we hear from churches that are like, well, we're fully inclusive. We welcome everyone. And what I talk about in the book is that I actually think these two extremes are like kind of similar in that they both conceal exclusion that we very well know is happening in churches from view. And Laura and Alan talked about that exclusion that's happening, right? That folks don't feel welcome, their families don't feel welcome, folks are leaving, right? Disabled people are not attending churches. So I'm just going to pick these apart briefly. The first statement is a falsehood, right? We know that disabled people constitute like 20% of the population. So you absolutely have people who are disabled in your congregation. And if you don't know who they are, chances are they don't feel, as Laura pointed out, safe, right? To talk about their experiences, and not all disabilities are visible. So this is a falsehood. Sometimes the worst part about this statement is it might be like aspirational. Oh, it's so great that we don't have any disabled people. We don't have to do anything. It's like, oh my gosh, for shame. You don't have any disabled people. As Alan was saying, in your congregation, you're missing out. So this is not something to brag about. Let's not say this. Let's not say this. And then the second statement critically obscures who is welcomed while maintaining church as inclusive. So you see in this statement, like, we're not centering disabled people. We're centering the church. The church is doing the work of welcoming everyone. But where are disabled people, right? Why do they matter? How do they contribute? My book goes into a lot more of the structural problems. So I just want to say briefly that I also get into why the accommodations process in the United States preserves institutional power at the expense of disabled people. And I talk about this problem that individual accommodations are not doing justice. They have not affected justice for disabled people. Disabled people in the US are, I don't know about Canada, but disproportionately poor and underemployed, unemployed. And yet, this is the predominant societal paradigm that we have, inclusion, and understandably, it's been adopted by the church for disability ministry. So my book asks, what can we learn from disabled people and their families when it comes to ministry in church settings? I'm going to turn off my slides again and read a little bit from my book about an encounter I had with a woman named Michelle. And before I get to Michelle, I'm going to tell you a biblical story. So I want to talk about Mary and Martha. This might be familiar to you. From Luke 10, verses 38 through 42. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. In early May 2019, I spoke over the phone with a young pastor at a large urban Presbyterian church with a thriving youth group program. He talked about the conflict he had in connecting with a family at the church who had two sons, one who was neurotypical and one who is autistic with intellectual disabilities, and his name is Jonah. And the pastor was particularly concerned about Jonah's inclusion in youth group. Pastor Brad and Michelle, Jonah's mother, would exchange numerous phone calls and texts, have an occasional in-person meeting, but still feel as though they were talking past one another. When Pastor Brad and I talked through the possibility of their church's participation in our research study, he had wearily asked me whether there were other churches that were doing this ministry well, or if all churches were struggling as much as his church was. We can't do what the school can, he protested when it came to Jonah's inclusion in youth group. But he also worried that if their church participated in the study, our response to Michelle would empower her to ask for more. She'd become an even larger thorn in Brad's side. Michelle, for her part, was deeply frustrated. She felt misunderstood and beaten down despite the multiple conversations between her and Brad. She stressed that the youth group needed to be inclusive. She felt that their unwillingness to acquiesce to this explicit purpose was a form of injustice. She was afraid that at youth group, Jonah was being left out or made fun of at worst, bewildered at best. She also hoped Jonah would have the positive experience she'd had growing up in a church of a close-knit, supportive youth group. She idealized the church of her youth and had joined this church with the hope that her children would have a similar experience to hers. She tearfully told me that her dream for Jonah was that when he was an adult, she and her husband Frank were no longer there would be enough people in Jonah's life who cared about him that he would not be alone. She had worked hard to ensure that Jonah was close to his extended family, and she hoped the church would be another group of people who cared about Jonah in his adult life. Brad told me he felt positively overwhelmed by that statement. How could the church take care of Jonah after Michelle and Frank were gone? In general, Brad expressed tremendous stress around the interactions he had with Michelle and Frank and the requests the family made. They keep moving the goalposts, he protested, with respect to the church's need to make accommodations toward Jonah's involvement in youth group. Even when Brad seemed to be able to do everything Michelle and Frank wanted for Jonah, he felt that they were still unsatisfied. Listening to Michelle, Frank, and Brad, I was reminded of the story Jesus tells us of his visit to Mary and Martha's house. As Martha busies and distracts herself with the many tasks of hosting, Mary sits at Jesus' feet, listening to what he has to say. In biblical times, Jesus' audacity in visiting a woman's house and Mary's audacity in sitting at Jesus' feet would have undermined his authority as a teacher, precisely because her behavior designated her as a disciple. In those times, rabbis would not have discipled women. In the story, Martha doesn't do anything wrong, but she also maintains her cultural role. She busies herself playing the role of host, yet Jesus boldly tells her this is but a distraction. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Michelle and Brad were busy too. No one could doubt that they were both working hard to find ways for the church to accommodate Jonah, but they were locked within a paradigm of inclusion. Every time Michelle asked for inclusion for Jonah and Brad refused to provide it, Michelle thought the church was giving up on Jonah, and Brad felt like he too was failing. Brad was probably right that the church couldn't live up to the standard of inclusion provided at Jonah's school, but he also didn't question whether inclusion should be the gold standard for ministry. Michelle knew what inclusion looked like for Jonah at school, and she knew what church had looked like for her as a child, and so she asked and advocated for what she thought her family needed. But putting herself and her family in the position of constantly asserting their rights to Brad was proving exhausting, distancing, and actually disempowering. With every interaction, with every request, she actually gave Brad and the church more power. Michelle and Brad became locked in a transactional relationship that made it impossible for them to see themselves on the same side, to listen to one another, let alone listen to Jonah or to Jesus. What Michelle and Brad couldn't see at the time was that the paradigm of inclusion actually prevented them from listening to one another and from doing ministry together. In this way, Michelle and Brad's struggle is instructive for so many of us who know that things are not as they should be for disabled people, but who are also realizing that the church can't resolve this injustice by creating better ministries and services for, quote, them. Rather, the church has to become an instrument of resistance and transformation against mere inclusion in the world, because Jesus's ministry, as illustrated by the story of Mary and Martha, seeks to uproot injustice, even injustice that looks like Martha's well-intentioned, busy-minded ministry. But if able-bodied people, like Michelle and Brad, are often the Marthas, not the Marys in the story, how do we become more like Mary and Jesus? How can we get to Mary if not through more and better ministry? What Jesus shows us in this passage is that ministry begins with really listening at the feet of those we seek to love and serve. It means being transformed by the hurt and the pain of the disabled people and their families who have somehow still, by the grace of God, made it to our pews. And it means lingering there, not for the sake of wallowing, but for the sake of witnessing to injustice in the world, beholding and lamenting the wrong in the powerlessness of disabled people, rather than sweeping it under the rug. Jesus reminds us that paying attention to disabled people's pain is key to understanding and loving Jesus. And the passage ends there, but I'd like to continue to talk about this problem with transactional ministry, this idea of transactional ministry that I was talking about, and talk about how we can move away from this, right? Because I said this is not the ideal. So one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest consequences of the paradigm of inclusion is that it forces people like Michelle to become advocates for accommodations rather than people. So kind of like the superheroes and saints, right? Michelle is in this role of pushing for supports and services for Jonah. And then Brad saw her at that point as nothing more than a social worker, strategically advocating for things that the church was not resourced to provide. At that point, it didn't matter whether Michelle's requests were reasonable or not, because that relationship was broken. And the more Michelle asked, the more Brad did this gatekeeping move that dehumanized and disempowered her. And of course, it was disempowering for Michelle because her requests weren't being heard. They were being dismissed. It was dehumanizing for both of them because they started to relate to each other as transactors, locked in a struggle for resources. And it was broken in that the church then maintained a position of power over Michelle, Jonah, and her family that Brad didn't even want to be in. Brad's point all along was that the church couldn't provide what Michelle was asking for, but when he was denying her request, he was actually subtly maintaining power, the church's position of power as gatekeeper when it came to access and inclusion for Jonah. So I talk about in the book how advocating for accommodations in a world that refuses to provide them is exhausting. And there's really no way to advocate without complaining, listing one's demands. And when we require this of disabled people and parents and caregivers, to actually get equal access or at least reasonable access to rights and education and social services, I hope you're starting to see the cycle. We lock them into this cycle, this problem. And this is especially clear in the United States with all our legislation. I won't get into that. But it really reminds me of the judge in Luke 18, 1-8. And I don't know how familiar you are with this passage, but in this passage, Jesus says that this judge had neither fear of God nor respect for people, but he was bothered by a persistent widow who wanted what was due to her. She was seeking justice. And then he ultimately just gave her what she wanted in order to avoid further interaction with her. And so Jesus uses this parable to demonstrate the fallenness of our concepts of justice in the world and the faithfulness of the widow, in contradistinction to the indifference of the judge. But what we do is we keep putting disabled people and families into this position. We keep asking them to shoulder the burden. We keep asking them to, protest, right, to come to the church in this way. And so then the church becomes none other than the unjust judge. So I want to talk a little bit, of course, in the last couple minutes, like, how do we get out of this, right? This is a picture of kind of thinking about transactions, right? And ministry in this way. And I want to move beyond that. So how do we do that? One way is witnessing and attending to the pain that is behind this language of isolation. And I was struck that Laura and Alan, you used this language as well, and that parents use this language. And in my study, a lot of parents talked about how isolated they were. And one of the things that I noticed that was happening is that when parents or families would say they were isolated, the church would hear, "Oh, you don't have enough services. Oh my goodness, we got to make sure we get you what you need." And they would start sending them meals and all this stuff. This is like best case scenario, right? In a lot of cases, nothing happens, but they would start giving them things or sending them things they need, or they would say, "We can't do that." But what happens is this is all about transaction. And families have been taught to speak the language of inclusion. So sometimes even when they're saying they're isolated, they're saying, "Well, I don't have this, I don't have that, I don't have this." But when you look deeply at kind of what's behind isolation, it's pain and sadness and hurt. And that is such an opportunity for the church to actually hear families clearly and what's being said. It kind of reminds me of what you all said before about that the church knows how to do grief. We actually know how to meet people. And we have scriptures to help us do that in their pain and their sadness. And yet we jump so quickly in this transactional relationship that we kind of miss each other. So in the book, I give a couple opportunities to do ministry differently. In working with a Catholic parish named St. John Chrysostom outside of Philadelphia, I became familiar with something called listening sessions. And I want to talk a little bit about St. John's and how they did listening sessions, and talk a little bit about what listening sessions entail as a practical tool. It's not a how-to. This may not work for everybody, but in churches where there are a lot of folks, disabled folks and families, and things, and we're hearing that things aren't working well, or we're not hearing that, they're just not coming to church, listening sessions can offer an opportunity for disabled folks and their families to be heard and for churches to actually hear what's going on. I talk about in the book, it's important that we don't treat listening sessions as a means to an end. So, okay, the listening session is going to accomplish something, we're going to fix something. The listening session is the ministry. I talk about how it's important to set up these sessions such that clergy and leaders in the church don't outnumber disabled people and their families. And I don't want to actually, in that terminology, depict that disabled people can't be leaders. Of course they are, but that disabled folks and their families need to be highly represented in these conversations so that they feel safe, right? If you have more people listening than speaking, it can be really scary. And I recommend that you gather around a table. And then I also recommend that you open and close with the Psalms, because when Laura was speaking about paradox, the Psalms, right, are full of paradox and also full of emotion. And they really set the tone for the fact that we're just trying to listen and hear one another in these conversations. So then what I recommend is that church leaders ask simple and straightforward questions, like, what have your experiences at church been like? You know, what do you want from us? What's working? What's not working? What do you wish would change? I went really quickly through that. I'll just like stay on that for a second. I'm just like mindful of time. And then I recommend that church leaders, as they're hearing these experiences, they take notes, they listen presently, and they respond with simple affirmations like, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate what you shared with us today. I'm sorry to hear that that's been your experience. And I think it's really important to say, like, you might be apologizing for something that happened in some other church 20 years ago. So what? What an amazing opportunity, right? To offer repentance on behalf of the church, for church that the church hurt that the church caused. So this is kind of the structure of listening sessions. And there's no, particular structure. And in some churches, it won't be necessarily safe to enter into these conversations right away, but the hope is that eventually it will be. In some churches, it won't necessarily even be safe for disabled people. Like I'm thinking of Michelle and Brad. I don't think if, Ralston held a listening session and Michelle and Jonah came together, I think it would be painful for Jonah to hear Michelle's experience. So the church leaders need to use their discernment about whether separate spaces might be important for disabled people and their caregivers. But I want to focus in the last couple minutes on a couple ways of witnessing and paying attention that do take into account how do we listen to young people like Jonah, right? Because Laura made the point that in ministering to Jonah, we're ministering to Michelle. So Jonah is such an important person that actually gets like completely shut out in this transactional ministry in a way that's not faithful. So how do we do that? So I'm going to share a little bit about that from the book. And I will stop sharing just for a moment. So when I spoke with Michelle in early May 2021 about her experiences at Presbyterian Church of Ralston, she reiterated feeling at times like Jonah was in school because church under Brad's leadership was like a black box. How was Jonah doing? Was he okay? She had no idea because Brad would not give her any information. I just want to know that someone is noticing him, she said with emotion in her voice. God notices him, the pastor and me instinctively responded, and I could tell, given her tireless efforts, that Michelle believed that. But she didn't have any evidence from the church that that was the case. Early on in the research, Brad told me that the strangest thing about the conflict for him was that Jonah was actually doing really well in youth group. Michelle acknowledged that she said he liked it. Jonah liked youth group, so she kept sending him and tried not to worry. How is he doing well? How is Jonah doing well? I asked Brad. And he gave me several examples of how Jonah followed the rules meticulously while other kids goofed off. And that was really great to see. And then Jonah had volunteered to participate in leading a game, and how when Brad looked over to see Jonah sitting at dinner, Jonah was never alone. He always had other kids sitting with him. Have you shared any of these examples with Michelle? I asked. No, Brad quickly responded. He replied that he didn't think the stories were particularly noteworthy. I encouraged him to share them with Michelle. I think she knows, Brad argued. They're a great family. Everyone loves having them here. Have you told them that, I asked? Told them that we're glad you're here, he asked. Yes, I replied. Sure, I'm sure we said it. You can't say it enough, I responded. You need to tell them every time you see them. No matter the quality of the interaction, good or bad, we're so glad you're here. The reason, I explained, is that families with disabled children are getting the message from every institution in society that they are a burden, that their presence requires extra labor, extra money, extra attention, and that their kids are not worth it. Brad had given Michelle and her family this impression over and over as he painstakingly protests that they couldn't meet Michelle's demands. Even if he was indicating that they couldn't meet those demands, not because Jonah wasn't worth it, but because the church didn't have resources, what do we think Michelle likely took from those interactions? The only interactions that Michelle and Brad were having regarding Jonah were about resources. But Brad had the opportunity to shift the conversation, to listen to Jonah by noticing him. So there's two practical tools there that I just want to make sure that I mention. And those are listening beyond inclusion. So that tactic of noticing, and this kind of goes with celebrating that you all talked about, noticing what children, what young people, what are their gifts, and naming them. And then the other piece I named of listening well, and so this is active listening, right? It's when you're kind of reflecting back, is emphasizing how glad you are that families with disabilities are there, because it is not easy for them to be there. As Laura said, it often doesn't feel safe. So the rest of the book makes clear that listening will not be easy. It often involves heeding the criticism, even the rebuke of disabled people, and I think the church deserves it. It often involves action, particularly letting go of power for able-bodied ministers and ministries so that disabled ministers and leaders can be centered in ministry with disabled people. I mean, that just makes sense that disabled people should be centered in ministry with disabled people, but it's often not the case. So on a personal note, I just want to conclude. I was a little worried when Laura asked me to speak today, because I kind of thought, I'm not sure my book has that much to offer parents. But then I thought back to, this conversation that Laura and I had about her research and what she just named in the research presentation earlier, that in ministering to disabled children, you really are ministering to parents. And so perhaps this centering of disabled children, disabled people, ministry, leadership in the life of the church can recenter the family so that the whole family, right, can flourish. And this is the vision for justice and a multiplicity of visions of human flourishing, the hope that I have for the church. So I want to close with a vision of my own. I mentioned my daughter, Lucia. So this is Lucia. And, during COVID, we've been really locked down because Lucia is immunocompromised. So this is a picture of what school has looked like for Lucia. That's her teacher on the left and her occupational therapist on the right. They've come to our home and they've done what we call porch school, patio school, meeting her where she needs it for her education. And she is thriving. So this is a picture of things that she's learning to do with her hands. I want to show you a short video, if we have time, of how she's communicating these days. And then I just have like a very short anecdote to wrap up. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share, let's see, a video that I have. Okay. So this is how Lucia communicates. All right. More to say? Turn the page? I don't know.
Nope.
I do, me, mine, you do it, you, your turn, not? Is it a yes?
That's a yes.
Okay. Is it I do, me, mine? Yes. Okay. I do. Yes. Okay. I do. So let's go to activities.
Oh, what do you want to do, Lucia?
No. Not, don't, can't. Want, play. No. Hug, rest, take a break.
home activities?
I don't know.
I think it was a no there.
Maybe right. Yeah.
Something to drink? Toys? Book or story? Yes or no?
I think that was an attempt at a yes.
Something to drink, toys, book or story? Show us yes or no. Big girl, yes or no? Yes, okay.
Good job.
Something to eat or drink? No.
No.
Do you want to play with toys?
Yes. Okay.
All right, so we have to pick a toy. Oops, sorry.
Whoa.
Mommy will help you pick a toy. Do you want doggy, birds, or creepy Teletubby? Yes or no? Doggy, birds, creepy Telly? No. No.
Looks like a no.
Okay. Xylophone, play laptop, play piano. Big smile. Is it a yes or no? Ooh.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Xylophone? No. Play laptop? No. Play piano? You were playing piano this afternoon. You were laying down playing piano. You're saying no, though. So, okay, then I'll keep going. Quack stick, moo cow, turn the page. Yes. Do you want your quack stick? Quack stick, yes or no? Yes. And that's what we were playing with before. Yeah, Mommy has it right here. You can play with it.
But I wasn't done.
Yeah, is that what you wanted?
Yeah.
Right here.
Wow, Lucia.
Good
So
job. Wow.
clever.
And you went all the way through the book to say, "Give me back my toy, Mommy."
So as you can see, communication with Lucia requires a lot of patience and interpretation. And it requires that my husband and I wait on her, and that we also, I mean, we had to show up for the communication moment. She knows this book better than I do. And so a lot of it is interpretation, and it's exciting and it's wonderful. And it's not always possible. So the thing that, about Lucia is she's medically complicated. She's actually in the hospital right now. She's been going through a period where 1 to 2 days a week, she can't do all this stuff. She can't communicate. She can't hold her head up. She can't sit in this chair. And this is a story of my own ableism, because I have just been mourning this. Like, we have this incredible communication book, and Lucia is doing so many things. And this is my vision of what flourishing looks like for her. But I want to show you one more picture of flourishing that Lucia has led me to. This is Lucia in her bed, watching her laptop, and she's thrilled. And Lucia has been showing us over the last couple of weeks that she can't do this communication thing every day. She can't sit up in that chair every day. She needs rest. And so what it looks like for her to flourish is to have this time of rest. And I find that as an able-bodied parent, as someone who's so excited about her communication, I just want to push her. I want her to get into that chair and do everything she's capable of doing. And she is leading me to remind me that she can flourish even from bed. And I, in my able-bodied lack of wisdom, didn't know that was a possibility. And boy, am I glad that God is making space, right, for all these visions of human flourishing. So I will leave us there today and hopefully open us up for discussion. And thank you so much for listening.